I have an awesome interview for y'all. I'm going to be sitting down with Jason Maier, the author of The Progressive Case for Bitcoin. This is a book published by Bitcoin Magazine, and I personally think it is the most important book published about Bitcoin since the Bitcoin Standard. I think it can have a massive impact on a group of people that, frankly, I think are adversarial or at least don't care about Bitcoin necessarily. And the reality is, they should care about Bitcoin because Bitcoin is for everyone, and Bitcoin has a lot of benefits from what progressive people care about. And that's what this book is about. So, without further ado, Jason, welcome to the show. Really excited to be chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about the book and the ideas in the book.
So, Jason, really quick, I kind of wanted to like get started with, what's the story behind us working together? I guess I could kind of just start, but I had been hearing about your book because of what Bitcoin did. I think that's most people heard of it because of that, because you reached out to him. I'm a big what Bitcoin did fan, so I was immediately interested for the very reasons that Peter was interested. Reached out to you, and yeah, I guess we'll let you take it over from there. What was it like working with Bitcoin Magazine books, and maybe even like why did you choose to work with us?
Yeah, no, it's like it goes without saying that my life has been a wild ride since I reached out to Peter McCormick, sort of cold emailed him and told him that I was writing a book. Did not expect to get a response from him, but obviously I did, and got a lot of attention about the book. CK, you reached out to me to make a connection and sort of explain that Bitcoin Magazine was trying to branch into this book thing, and we had a good talk. And ultimately, my relationship with Bitcoin Magazine to publish the book was something that I was excited about for a couple of reasons. One, maybe the most obvious is that this is a passion project for me. I'm excited about getting the book into people's hands and teaching them hopefully about Bitcoin and all of the benefits that it has. And I knew that Bitcoin Magazine would allow me to achieve that. And maybe the second really important reason is that, I was passionate about writing a book and I was not so passionate about doing all of the other nitty gritty little things that involve, getting a book actually published and out the door, like, stuffing envelopes and finding a copy editor and all of those things that Bitcoin Magazine was able to take care of. So it was definitely an exciting opportunity for me, and very grateful that I have the relationship and that things are going really well. I think that the book is profoundly better because I've worked with Bitcoin Magazine and gotten a lot of really helpful guidance and positive feedback from you all. And so, the rest is history, right? Like everything's really going well for the book and for the project, and very grateful for that opportunity.
Well, we are very grateful. We're really honored for the privilege to be able to publish this book. And again, we think that it is really going to be, and it already is, a really important book for Bitcoin's adoption and understanding into the future. So I guess, like, what's the plan now that the book is out? I know that it's summer now. You teach. What's coming up next for the book? I know you were just at an event and you sold out. How are you going to be promoting this thing?
Yeah, so if people have followed me, they know that I'm a high school math teacher. That's my day job, and I have a year off from doing that. I actually have just started my sabbatical now, and so the premise of the sabbatical was directly to promote the book, go out there and educate people about Bitcoin on the ground, and sort of get my book into people's hands. So you mentioned I was just in Boston at an event, the Freedom Festival up there, which was phenomenal. Brought a bunch of books with me, brought all of the books that I had actually, and sold all of them. Left with the empty box, which was a good feeling. Had to turn people away, so that's a
Gotta get
good
you more
sign.
books.
Yeah, no, it's a good problem to have. So really, like for the next year, I'm just going to keep putting myself in the way of opportunity and do events like that. Right, go out, meet Bitcoiners, go to meetups. Hopefully, sell my book, sign my book. Talk to people on the ground, and then maybe even more importantly is to just continue to reach out to non-Bitcoin people, right? Pre-coiners who don't know a lot about Bitcoin, but they're interested. They might be curious. they might have heard a lot of negative things about it, but are willing to learn. So, you're going to see me, anywhere that I can get to within driving distance. If you have a locally owned bookstore or like a library or a university or a school, like, there's a good chance I'm going to show up with a pile of my books and be willing to talk about it, do seminars, do, book talks. So that's the year, right? Is just literally to be with my family and to promote Bitcoin and promote the book.
Awesome. Well, hey, if you organize an event, if you have a podcast, get Jason on. He has a really important message. We're going to dive into that on this show. But I could not encourage, working with, a more incredible gentleman, but also just such an awesome book. So everyone, talk to Jason, have him on your show, help this cause because it really is that important for Bitcoin. Jason, let's talk a little bit about I don't want to talk about your journey because there's a lot of other great shows that kind of tell about Jason's story, but I want to dive into one specific part of your Bitcoin journey, which is that most Bitcoin content creators are libertarian and cap conservative people. And you described yourself as all the way progressive, but you're very interested in Bitcoin, and you put in the work to like learn and listen to opposing voices, which is not an easy thing. Like I have to force myself to listen to opposing voices of my own opinions. And that's something that I work at and put effort into. But, to do that all the time, to get your 10,000 hours in and it's like 95%, opposing voices is not easy. Like tell us about your Bitcoin education experience, having to learn from libertarians, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because I think that the default for most people, no matter where you fit on the political spectrum or whatever you have strong beliefs about, it's just not our human nature necessarily to expose yourself to like people who disagree with you constantly. I told this anecdote before where it's like, all right, well, there's been times when I've turned on Fox News, but it was mostly like a joke, right? Like I wasn't going to actually watch it.
I also
And
do that.
yeah, and I think that, like it became really clear right away that if I was going to want to learn about Bitcoin and the community around Bitcoin and what effects it has and what are the benefits, which I was really motivated to do, that I was going to run up against people who just don't agree with me politically. They're going to make comments, hold beliefs. They're going to make assumptions about the audience that don't necessarily fit me. And that was just my experience sort of throughout. Like, in fact, that's one of the reasons I got the idea to write the book, which is to say that because I had such a conviction for Bitcoin from a mathematical computer science lens, I understood the technology enough to know that it was promising. I was able to sort of get past that stuff that I disagreed with in terms of politics, right? People, name calling or making jokes at, my expense, not my expense, but like people like me, like that kind
There's a
of stuff.
lot of it. Like it's
Right.
a real dynamic. It really is.
Right. And if I think that, in all honesty, I think people who are on podcasts or do shows or talk about Bitcoin a lot just fall into this sort of rut of assuming that everybody listening to the message or the podcast agrees with them or will laugh at the same jokes. And and if you sort of take a step back and realize that there's a lot of different kinds of people who are into Bitcoin and a lot of different kinds of people watching shows, listening to interviews, that's not always the case. And so, I got to the point where I built up some calluses. I was okay to sort of like gloss over a sentence or two and say, all right, well, like that doesn't speak to me, but this whole other message about Bitcoin does speak to me. And I think it was a really powerful moment for me to realize that like there are people out in the world who are good, well-intentioned people who are operating from sort of, assuming the best, and I don't agree with them, but they're not bad people. They're not evil. They're not trying to like do horrible things. They're just sort of coming about the same problems that I see in the world from a different perspective. And so by learning about Bitcoin, I was able to sort of make that connection and say, all right, well, if I listen to an interview with so and so, it's okay that I don't agree with the sort of like the non-Bitcoin content that gets sort of slipped in, as long as I agree with the Bitcoin stuff or it helps me understand Bitcoin better. There were plenty the hour you say 10,000 hours. There's plenty of hours of me listening to books, podcasts, interviews where I was just was not in the most comfortable state, right? Like it's like people is saying things
You're
I
like
didn't agree
tense.
with.
You're tense
Right.
listening to the show. I know
Right.
exactly what that's like.
Yeah, and I, so like I referenced that sort of experience too to say like if you find yourself right now, you're into Bitcoin and you like it and you understand that it has promise to change the world and make it better, you can read my book even if you're not progressive, because I certainly have read plenty of books that I disagree with politically. It just helps me understand a different group of people. And I think the same can work in the opposite direction too. So that was eye opening. The whole experience was eye opening. It obviously motivated me to put out a resource out there for people to learn. It was, yeah, it's been really fascinating to see that progression.
Would you be willing to name, some of the, I just say like some of the most effective libertarian educators, the ones that like you really, their points really sat well with you?
Yeah. I think that there's something to take from, from everybody, right? And I think that if you really focus in on the Bitcoin stuff in particular, you can get a lot out of it, right? So like, somebody, you're putting me on the spot, but like, somebody like
Sorry
Breedlove.
about it.
No, no, it's fine. Like I'll just name like Breedlove has phenomenal content about money and about what is money and how Bitcoin fits into that picture. And I find a lot of his other takes offensive or off-putting or things that I don't agree with. Right. So that might be a good example of somebody who's out there in the Bitcoin space who, maybe a lot of people just would magnify with like, recognize Robert Breedlove is like Bitcoin and what he says, a lot of people agree with no matter what. I don't necessarily agree with most of the things he says, but I've learned a lot from him, and there's lots of other people too that might fit into that category.
Yeah, Breedlove was one that for some reason I thought you were going to mention, but yeah, I mean, I think like some of his thought provoking elements about like time and the
Mhm.
number zero,
Mhm.
and the effects of money on society is some of the most profound stuff out there. It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's I've learned a lot from him too. I kind of wanted to dive a little bit more into like what do you actually consider to be progressive values, because I think it's kind of a loaded term, for
Yeah.
everyone. So I'm curious, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I don't necessarily view it as a loaded term, right? It's just sort of how I identify. And I think there's a lot of different ways to identify like what progressive means. There's people on the political spectrum that are even to the left of me who are also into Bitcoin. Um, but just generally speaking, I think that you know, values like well, first of all, like we'll just start at the very basic, right? Like I'm not somebody who thinks that the government shouldn't exist anymore and that Bitcoin is like the key to get rid of the government. Like first of all, like I just don't believe that. So that's like maybe number one. Two, I think that there's opportunities as a society to protect vulnerable people and to make sure that the people that society marginalizes or discriminates against have a protection, have a safety net, have support, and that's very general and vague, but there's specific policies that that are well intentioned towards that effect that I support. I think there's a lot of problems with inequality and wealth concentration that are essentially fiat created problems. And there's a lot of people, at least in America, on the political left that are trying to solve that problem with fiat ways. So, in means of fiat. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that Bitcoin provides a different perspective. I think that, a lot of what I've heard from the space, it doesn't resonate with me because it's not necessarily inclusive to a broad swath of diverse human beings. And I think that that's sort of one of the things that I try to push back against. So, the definition of progressive doesn't mean that like I'm a sort of hopeless statist, but I do think the government should exist or will exist into the future. and that the government can invoke well-intentioned policies to try to help people, and that it's our responsibility as an engaged populace to try to advocate for ourselves and to push the politicians to do what we think is right. And having said that, I think that there's a lot of things wrong with the government, and I think most progressives agree with this. Right? There's wariness about the government on both sides of the political spectrum. It's not as if people who vote for Democrats just love the government unconditionally, no matter what they do. There's a lot of pushback about certain aspects of what the government's doing or how they're trying to achieve their goals. So it's a lot more nuanced than I think a lot of people would like to think. Right? There's this caricature of somebody out there who has pink hair and is a communist and screams a lot. And I just don't. I think that's a convenient caricature to fight against if you're in the mood to fight against people, but it's not really indicative of reality. Most of my social network outside of Bitcoin are liberal and progressive people, and they're very normal, like very reasonable, have nuanced and diverse points of view. So I think that it's not an easy question to answer necessarily, but most definitely the answer is more nuanced than a lot of people, especially who want to argue against me, would like to believe.
Totally. I mean, I would say like I'm from California originally, so
Mhm,
I would identify my political leanings as like much more libertarian. Um,
mhm,
but I would say more than anything else, I'm a Bitcoiner. I think that like the new system that is Bitcoin solves a lot of problems and is worth propagating. But if I look back at my college or high school or middle school friend group and those people, I keep in touch with them and I care deeply about those people. And they're very much they would consider themselves progressive as well. When I was living in San Francisco, that was my entire cohort of people around me.
mhm.
So just saying like, there's a lot of like very normal average people, actually the majority, I think mathematically the
Mhm.
majority who align with this perspective again. And that's why I think this book is so important, because this book outlines how Bitcoin maps to progressive ideals and the things that a lot of people care about.
Yeah, no, and that's really the whole point, right? The target audience of the book, like the addressable market, is all of the people who vote for Democrats because they don't really see another option or a better option. Not that they're like love the government and are like hopeless statists. They're just like living a normal life and they don't know a lot about Bitcoin. Like that's a huge addressable market. Like you say, like over a majority of people would probably fit into that camp. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that the book provides hopefully an opportunity for those, we'll call them pre-coiners, to just learn and engage with Bitcoin in a way that's new to them. And, what I think the book, what I try to do in the book is sort of highlight what are the problems that progressive people see with like the legacy system, the political system, the financial system, and then offer Bitcoin as a different lens through which to look at the problem. Like Bitcoin is not really thought of in most circles, in most mainstream circles, as like a lens to look at problems, and I'm trying to do that. And it also presents, in obvious ways to you and me, solutions to a lot of those problems. So it's really just holding up a new lens for a lot of people to look at, like wealth inequality, war, the impact on environment in ways that are really counterintuitive to a lot of what people have learned through the media or through their social circles or what have you. So that's the hope, that people can look at those problems in a new way.
Okay, well, let's dive into some of those
Mhm,
specific problems. War, environment, wealth inequality. These are huge, huge issues.
mhm.
I think I would say these are huge fiat-driven issues, and I think that you definitely see that as a fiat as a culprit. Can you just talk about maybe one at a time? The issue, and then the way that like the way that you frame Bitcoin as a lens and potentially a solution.
Sure. I think that the most important chapter in the book, because of the audience, is the chapter on the environment, because this is the number one source of FUD, and it's probably the easiest and most emotionally charged for a lot of progressive and liberal people. And the idea that I'm giving the audience a new lens through which to think about energy use and energy waste and energy consumption and how Bitcoin fits into that picture is really important, because right now there's a lot of people who are doing just sort of layer one thinking about like, well, if you use energy, and I don't personally see why it's useful, then that's a waste. So like energy use equals bad from like square one. And it's actually a pretty subtle argument that's involved to make a counter argument against that, to say like, okay, well, energy use equals bad is not like the whole story. You need to think about, what is the energy being used for? What is the energy, what is that thing incentivizing? What's the big picture look like in terms of energy creation, energy distribution, energy consumption across the grid? And how can we do essentially a lot what a lot of progressive and liberal people want, which is more renewable sources of energy, which we all know are intermittent, and Bitcoin mining can help with that. So just really providing a whole different scope and a different angle to look at the problem, and say, instead of Bitcoin being a problem in this sort of arena, this environmental arena, it's actually a solution, which is completely counterintuitive based on everything that you hear from, a lot of famous liberal politicians or the media. Like, this is actually the opposite of what most people think. So that's really the most important chapter. I talk about wealth inequality and this, and sort of the government's relationship with big banks, both of which are hot button issues for liberals and progressives, and both of which are really like fundamental to like the story of Bitcoin, right? Like, Bitcoin, in its essence, is a protest against too big to fail banks, and the relationship that governments have with banks in terms of bailing out and supporting them and sort of turning a blind eye towards their misdeeds. These are all things that liberals and progressives don't like, right? So Bitcoin offers, at least in theory, a really solid opportunity to look past like a banking industry, or to reform it in a way that works for everyday people, on a peer-to-peer, decentralized, uncensorable way. So those are a couple of things. I think that I have a chapter about war, and I think that war and peace and how Bitcoin can play a role in that. And I try to go into to explain that, the wars that we have now, which, who are benefiting from those wars, who are paying for those wars, who's fighting in those wars, like, this is all happening on a global stage, and it's all made possible and longer and deadlier, and more disruptive because of fiat money printing, and how, as opposed to different armed conflicts in the past, like what we have going on even now today, is only possible because the government doesn't have to go to the people and say, we're fighting this war. This is why it's important. And this is what we want to do with the money that we're collecting from you to fight the war. They're just printing the money, and they don't have a direct, tangible connection to the people that voted for them, or who are going off and doing the fighting and the dying. And so Bitcoin offers an opportunity to rein in a government in that specific way, to say, like, you just don't get to fight a war without talking to the people and without raising taxes or without making sacrifices. You actually have to do those things, if we had a system of government and a financial system that was tied to Bitcoin in an important, meaningful way. So those are a couple of examples. I also talk about how Bitcoin helps marginalized people and communities, the international impact of the dollar hegemony system, and how Bitcoin can offer sort of a neutral and flat global reserve currency where one nation doesn't have an advantage over all of the others. All of these things speak to progressive values and things that, fairness and sort of, equal access to opportunity that progressive people care about, but in a way that most progressives haven't heard before because they're not into Bitcoin yet. So yeah, there's plenty to sort of go through and talk about, but those are some of the highlights. Oh, I think
That
I'm
was
on.
absolutely fantastic. No, that was my bad. But no, I really appreciate you diving into those specific points, and you and several others. There's many other people emerging in the progressive Bitcoiner camp who are really, they're trying to help frame Bitcoin in a way that appeals to new people. That's like, no one's changing Bitcoin. No one's like, doing whatever. It's really just about framing Bitcoin in a different way. Folks like Daniel Batten,
Mhm.
Alex Gladstein, they're doing such good jobs of like finding more use cases and finding more ways to talk about this stuff. And it's just so powerful. And,
Mm.
I guess, why don't you talk a little bit about this kind of progressive Bitcoiner coalition that's kind of emerging?
Yeah, I mean, it's has been fascinating to watch, and to learn about and to join the community, the dynamic community of progressive Bitcoiners. That a lot of people might have heard this already, but like when I started writing the book, I wasn't on social media. I didn't have a Twitter account. I didn't really know anybody in the space like proper. I just decided to write a book. And and when I wrote the book, like Daniel Batten wasn't really a thing. Like Troy Cross hadn't gone on What Bitcoin Did. Margot Paez hadn't gone. Like Alex Gladstein hadn't, released his first book, Check Your Financial Privilege. So like in that moment, I sat down and like started a Google Doc to write a book. Certainly wasn't expecting to learn and to find out about this great community. So as you say, there's tons of people in the space. I say tons, but there's a growing number of people in the space who consider themselves progressive or at least align with certain progressive values that I talk about in the book, and who are sort of mission aligned with what I'm doing. There's a reboot right now of a great podcast called The Progressive Bitcoiner that's going to be happening like this summer. And tons of great, thoughtful guests coming on and talking about Bitcoin in that way. So, no shortage of really thoughtful, committed people to the cause of bringing Bitcoin to a new audience, making it more accessible, making it friendlier, making it, whatever, like just learning about it friendlier. And, that gives me hope because I'll be honest, like in my own naivete, like I thought like I might have been one of the only ones, right? But in reality, there's like a huge population out there. And one of the biggest, most common points of feedback I get about the book now that it's out and people are reading it is just, the gratitude from the community because there's more progressives out there than you think. And they're reaching out to me to thank me for writing the book that they always kind of wanted out in the space. And it's just humbling for me to have done that for those people and for all of the people in the future that are going to come into the space. Because that's kind of what I wanted. That was the hope, is to have a resource that I can hand to somebody I cared about and say, I love you and I want you to learn about Bitcoin. And this is a book that could speak to you. Obviously, the book isn't going to speak to everybody, but I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who say, "I've been in Bitcoin for a really long time, and I'm always been kind of turned off by the certain sort of the influencers and the content creators that are out there, and they're just really grateful that a book like this exists." So. I'm grateful for the support and really grateful for the opportunity to join into that community that already existed and continues to grow.
No, totally. And, Peter McCormick inside his forward and, when on shows talking about it, he says that this is actually one of the most important books for conservatives because, like a conservative like myself, I have a lot of progressive people in my life and I need to give them something that is going to be effective at, orange pilling them. So, hey, my mom is very, very Christian. I got her, thank God, for Bitcoin. My
Mhm.
wife is much more progressive. I'm going to have her read this when I'm done. So, I think it's really important that we have educational content like this that speaks to a lot of different audiences, and ultimately, I think Bitcoin helps us find common ground. You were at a freedom fest in Massachusetts with a lot of conservative, freedom oriented, libertarian type people, and I'm sure the organizers and a lot of the speakers were of that description. But you're selling out books. You're meeting people who have passionate about different diets than you and still their friends. And maybe that's wasn't something that you would have done before Bitcoin, but I think Bitcoin's like this. It helps us find that common ground.
Yeah, and I find this time and time and again, right? Like I have a conversation with somebody who doesn't agree with me politically, maybe is on a different sort of side of the spectrum than I am, but you can have a responsible, like respectful conversation about them about issues. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the Bitcoin community is that when two Bitcoiners sit down and talk, even if they don't agree, that they're going to come about that conversation in good faith. So I'm not trying to score cheap political points or name call or make you feel bad about what you believe. I might not agree with you, but when you and I have a conversation, we're gonna treat each other with respect and understand that we're both trying to solve the problems that exist in the world, maybe from a different perspective. But that's super important because there's not a lot of things like that that are bridging that gap right now. And Bitcoin is one example, and hopefully it will continue to be, and that will that effect will grow over time.
Awesome. Well, while you're saying that, I was getting an idea. A good podcast would be, let's dive into like how we think about the future Bitcoin world and tease out where maybe our visions are different. I think that could be a
Mhm.
very interesting conversation. But I want to talk about like, you down, down a longer timeline, you might be the most, influential person to progressives in Bitcoin. That would be an awesome, end result of this book. I want to talk about, how have you been effective at orange pilling progressives? Like, what have, if you talk to someone who's progressive, maybe another teacher at your school or something like that,
Mhm.
what's been effective at, getting them to be interested in Bitcoin?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing, and this is true for everybody really, is just to meet the person where they are. And so, I've had decades of experience teaching high schoolers math, and I'm trying to leverage what I've learned to teach people about Bitcoin. And there's a lot of similarities there, right? So, really, if you're face to face with a person that you care about or that you know, and you're trying to orange pill them, it's really important to just understand what it is that they care about. So it's like, it's never wrong to start by asking questions or to try to tease out what are the issues that they really care about, what are the problems that they see in the world as it is today, and then go from there, right? Like if you know enough about Bitcoin and you're really passionate about it, you're going to be able to find some sort of avenue that's going to speak to them. And so, start by asking questions, meet the person where they are. Don't try to teach them too much at once. And then get them asking questions, right? Because as we know, most people haven't really thought about like what is money, why does it have to come from the government, what gives money value? All of those questions are things that people just sort of gloss over and as they're living their day to day life. So the minute you start getting people to slow down and actually think about those questions and what the consequences are, then you're going to make good headway. And then sort of just like I said, lay out sort of the case that Bitcoin can offer these different perspectives, or you might be in a position where you have to sort of counteract some of the FUD or the misconceptions that people have, and that's okay. But then just, again, just try to engage in the conversation in a dialogue in a respectful way that acknowledges that that person hopefully wants to learn and is open to learning. And that's what I found to have the most success. I'm not, I don't have 1,000 batting average in terms of orange pilling progressive people. Sometimes I had to go back and try a different tact, right? So if I think I might get them with the environmental, like, the good news Bitcoin has for the environment, that might not work. I have to, try something else. And, so that's what the book is essentially, is sort of like the greatest hits. It's 10 chapters, and like each one of those chapters is going to have something to do with like what has worked with somebody that I care about in terms of orange pilling them.
No, I mean, I think that that's really important, especially meeting people where they're at. Bitcoiners should take that advice no matter who they are trying to orange pill. It's
Yeah.
always good to figure out, what does this person care about? And then it's a lot easier to kind of map Bitcoin onto it. And generally speaking, it's better to just talk about the problem more than even Bitcoin, really. I kind of
Mhm.
want to talk a little bit, because I think we have a little more time here, but I kind
Mhm.
of want to talk a little bit about Bitcoin as like an environmental solution.
Mhm.
Um, you know, the environment is very important to me. I think a lot of conservatives are like, we're pro gas and all this kind of stuff, and they also care about the environment.
Yeah.
I want to steel man. Like a lot of them think that what's best for humanity and what's best for the environment and what the Earth can sustain, is a certain way. Like not like people are trying to boil the oceans. No one wants to do that. Everyone wants to live a comfortable life
Right.
on this planet. Um, but in terms of Bitcoin as a solution for the environment, from my perspective, I think you can't actually be a serious conservationist or environmentalist if you don't take Bitcoin seriously, because the issues are really rooted in the actual energy infrastructure. And
Mhm.
if you understand enough about mining, you see how mining is like this fundamental solution to a lot of different issues on the grid and off the grid. Daniel Batten has a great graphic where he just like lists how it helps the renewable grids, lists how it helps normal grids, lists how it reduces methane. Talks about the macro implications as well. It's a great graphic. Maybe we'll share it in the show notes. But that's a little bit of a long-winded question. But
Sure.
Can you talk about this idea, like, of Bitcoin? Not only as it doesn't hurt the environment, Bitcoin is our best hope at aligning with the environment.
Right. Um, yeah, and again, like this is the longest and most important chapter of the book, right? Because this is what most people are going to be tuning into and hearing misconceptions about Bitcoin. And I'll say like one of the things that we don't talk about a lot, but is in the book is sort of like how Bitcoin lengthens your time horizon, right? Like you have if you're a Bitcoiner, then you have low time preference. You're willing to make sacrifices now for progress in the future. And like, how important is that lesson for somebody who wants to have a positive impact on the environment, right? Like human caused, damage to the environment is a long-term problem, and it's going to require a long-term solution. So just like off the bat already, you have like Bitcoin, the Bitcoin mindset is going to be a help. And I think that indirectly having something that is a deflationary monetary base that doesn't encourage people to just to consume for the sake of consuming because their dollars are going to be worth less tomorrow is also critically important for the environment. Like we are in a ever growing economy, has to always grow. We have to have inflation in order to have economy growing. People are spending their money on things because they break all the time. Like all of this stuff is just horrible for the environment. Like we have finite amount of resources and people just can't keep consuming just for the sake of consuming, right? There and right now people are incentivized to do that, and companies are incentivized to make sure that their phones break after 2 years and all of that. So you end up getting this hugely damaging effect on the environment just because of the way our economy is set up. So like all of that sort of indirect, like, hey, how can we help the environment, and how can Bitcoin do that? But just directly, like you said, like Daniel Batten does a great job of explaining to people, like, these are the impacts on renewable energy because you have this intermittent energy source. You need a large flexible load to balance that grid out and to sort of incentivize and monetize the build out of renewable energy. That doesn't happen without Bitcoin. There's just not a world in which it happens. Bitcoin is uniquely positioned to fill that role. I had an interesting conversation with somebody at an energy company in the Pacific Northwest who was like, listen, right now, like the kind of load that Bitcoin is putting onto the grid is exactly what we need. Like we need large, flexible load that can respond to changes in demand. It helps the energy company, it helps the energy grid, it helps the rate paying customers, it helps to build out a renewable energy like solar and wind. This person described to me that energy companies right now, sort of without being flashy about it, are racing to get the most valuable land in terms of solar and wind energy production right now because they know in 10 and 15 years, like they're going to be sort of socially forced in that direction. Well, to buy that land now and to build like energy resources on that land is not like there's no financial incentive to do that. But things like Bitcoin mining can sort of be the bridge that helps actually finance that build out of renewable energy. And that's what's happening right now behind the scenes with not just one, but like all energy companies are trying to do that. And there's really no way that I can see it happening without Bitcoin mining as a large flexible load that can sort of incentivize that build out and help supplement the income of those companies until there's a larger demand for the energy from regular consumers. So there's a lot of benefits for the environment that I talk about in the book, and some of them are indirect and some of them are direct.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit too about this idea of, you know, not only is being aligned with the environment and using our resources well important, but energy availability is also critically important. And it's easy, I'm here in the United States, I'm all plugged in,
Mhm.
we're talking over the internet. This
Right,
provides us so much utility and productivity, and we neither of us would be able to do what we do in Bitcoin without it. And yet a very large portion of the planet does not have any of this infrastructure built out.
right,
And the fiat world has offered no way for them to have it. It's not like this infrastructure is novel, it's all available, but the
right,
economics and the incentives don't allow for it. And I would say fiat puts people in that lower position. and maybe that's a little far fetched to blame it all on fiat. But I'm kind of curious, like, how
Yeah.
does Bitcoin, in I would say an environmentally sound way, bring people online? Like, talk about that argument too. And I think that's something that a lot of progressives or environmentalists, they just don't think about, is like this balancing act. We also have to get people online.
Yeah, and it's true, right? Like they say, like, oh, energy use equals bad is sort of the like a zero level of thinking about it. It's not like, what we want to.
Zero level. It's
Yeah, I mean,
crazy.
it's like, yeah, well, I mean, it's like an emotional plea, right? Like, oh, if you're like, because we all know, like, okay, if I would leave this room and I leave the light on, that's just wasteful. There's no reason for me to do that, right? And I think that, like, that speaks on an intuitive level. So that's why, like, politicians use that, right? Like, hey, Bitcoin mining uses energy, therefore it's bad, because it's going to just resonate on an emotional level with people. And so you have to like get past that and actually think about on the ground, like, what are we hoping to do, right? It's not that we all go back to a system where we're not using computers or electricity at all. We want the opposite. We want everybody to have access to the technology and to the advancements that you and I are enjoying. And there's example. I list them in the book at one of the chapters of examples of exactly this happening. Right, you want to bring electricity to a remote village, in the global south. There's a waterfall nearby that can actually provide the electricity, but there's no demand for the electricity because this village has been operating for the last 5,000 years without electricity. They don't have toasters to plug in, and so there's no demand for the electricity. Therefore, there's no incentive for somebody to go out and put the infrastructure in this way that is going to generate the electricity. So this is very similar to the idea that like Bitcoin mining can provide a bridge between the production of the electricity in a cheap way where it's a non-rival consumer, right? There aren't other customers that are like knocking on the door and saying we needed this electricity. Like there's not a hospital or an orphanage that's like going without. It's just using the energy that's being produced and paying the people who created the energy like a reasonable rate until the demand picks up. And now you can electrify a new village that never had electricity before because of the financial incentives that play with Bitcoin mining. And the same thing is true like all over the world, right? Like there's plenty of people who don't have electricity who need it. And just generally speaking, like a lot of environmentalists, a lot of progressives and liberals understand that we have to electrify more of our economy and more of our energy structure if we want to achieve our goals. Well, that doesn't happen without like the infrastructure and the incentives aligned to it, right? So they're just all across, right? Global South, Western liberal democracies, like all of us can benefit from it in really meaningful and important ways. And we just have to get past that like level zero thinking, right? You have to think a couple of steps down the line in order to actually appreciate the benefits.
Well, Jason, this has been a really, really valuable conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on. I'm going to have to get you back on. We're going to have to get deep into the history of progressivism and how things have changed, how people went from hippies to statists. And, well, maybe we can even talk about the future of Bitcoin and hyper Bitcoinization from our different perspectives. I think that would be a really awesome conversation. But, just to wrap this one up, I would love to give you the last word.
Sure. I mean, I think that I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate any chance to talk about the book and get the message out there. I think that really it's important for people if you've watched this and you're kind of skeptical of what I'm doing, just understand that I'm just trying to educate people about Bitcoin. And I saw an avenue for which that resource didn't exist, and that's what I'm trying to provide. So the goal for me is just to help people understand the value that Bitcoin has and the way it can reshape the world and help people. And I think that that's an important message to get out there. And like, this book is one way to do that, and I'm excited about it. But really, that's my goal. And so I think there's a lot of people probably out there who are mission aligned with that goal is to get more people understanding the benefits of Bitcoin and educating them. So I'll leave with that. I think that's a valuable goal and a valuable aspiration. So I hope people join me in that.
Where can people get the book, and where can they contact or reach you out to you?
Yep. So on Twitter, I'm C Jason Mayer, and DMs are open. Always try to reply as quickly as I can. Book is available, Bitcoin Magazine store. It's also available on Amazon. So highly encourage people to go out and get a copy for yourself, pass it along to a friend, or buy a couple copies so you give it out to people that you love. And I'm always happy to hear feedback and reach out from people. Always excited to hear people's reaction to the book.
We're working on getting these books into bookshelves too at bookstores. So I know Jason's going door to door. Bitcoin Magazine is working on the back end to make it available for libraries and bookstores and stuff like that. But you can do your part too by demanding that you want the book at your local bookstore too. So go and ask for it, and that'll help us out a lot too.
Yes.
Jason, thanks again for coming on. Everyone, please check it out. You can buy it for Bitcoin on the Bitcoin Magazine store. It's available internationally on Amazon, on Kindle, working on the audio book. But I can't recommend it enough. I've really been enjoying it so far. And there's going to be more content from Jason on Bitcoin Magazine coming out soon too. So keep an ear out and an eye out for that. But with that being said, Bitcoiners, thank you so much for listening. Peace.
Thank you, Miami, for the last 3 years in this amazing city. The whole world shut down, but Miami welcomed us with open arms. We want to show Bitcoin to the whole world. We are taking the conference on the road to set the stage for Bitcoin in a new city. Nashville. Bitcoin 2024 is coming to Nashville in Tennessee, a city that is known as a music and freedom city. Bitcoin 2024 in Nashville from July 25th to 27th.
Thank you, fellow Bitcoiners. You brought Bitcoin to the global stage.
Bitcoin came and Bitcoin was not expected by anybody.
Joining our 3-day ride on a mission of hyper-Bitcoinization with brilliant minds that raise the bar worldwide.
But it goes far deeper than that.
You listened to different angles and seen various perspectives. You dared to stand up and speak out.
If you love somebody, tell them to buy Bitcoin.
You were there to learn, teach, and inspire. Discovered opinions and arise with vision.
And everything less than that is pure madness.
You came together to collaborate and celebrate, side by side, for the greatest financial innovation. You came to Amsterdam, and you made history.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.